So I always say it's good to get different opinions, and today we're looking at the New York Times. This comes from I have no idea how you pronounce this. This is an Indian name, so Mr. Panjeka Mashek. I have no idea. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce foreign names. But anyway, the malign incompetence of the British ruling class, because this is exactly what I've been saying for so long about how a lot of this, this Brexit nonsense is based on this ridiculous myth. And really, he's right, because he has no sympathy at all for what we're doing at the moment. And I sort of agree. I read this, I thought, I can completely agree. And I'm from the UK. I can't feel sorry for us anymore. And I'm living in this country. It's a nightmare. But here we go. The malign incompetence of the British ruling class. With Brexit, the chumocrats who drew borders from India to Ireland are getting a taste of their own medicine. Describing Britain's calamitous exit from its Indian Empire in 1947, the novelist Paul Scott wrote that in India the British came to the end of themselves as what they were. That is, to the end of their exalted idea about themselves. Scott was among those shocked by how hastily and ruthlessly the British who had ruled India for more than a century condemned it to fragmentation and anarchy. How Lewis Mountbatten, accurately described by the right-wing historian Andrew Roberts as a malicious intellectual limited hustler, came to preside as the last British Viceroy of India over the destiny of some 400 million people. Britain's rupture with the European Union is proving to be another act of dereliction by the country's rulers. The Brexiteers are pursuing a fantasy of Imperial-era strength and self-sufficiency. They have repeatedly revealed their hubris, maliciousness and ineptitude over the past 2 years. Though originally a Remainer, Prime Minister Theresa May has matched their arrogance, absurdity and imposing the patently unworkable timetable of 2 years on Brexit and laying down red lines that undermined negotiations with Brussels and doomed her deal to a resounding bipartisan rejection this week in Parliament. Such a pattern of egotistic and destructive behaviour by the British elite flabbergasts many people today, but it was already manifest 7 decades ago during Britain's rash exit from India. Mountbatten, described as a master of disaster in the British naval circles, was a representative among a number of small group of upper and middle class British men from which the imperial masters of Asia and Africa were recruited. Abysmally equipped for their immense responsibilities, they nevertheless allowed Britain's brute imperial power to blunder through the world, a world whose richness and subtlety, as E.M. Foster wrote in Notes on the English Character, they could have no conception. Foster blamed Britain's political fiascos on its privately educated men, callow beneficiaries of the country's elitist public school system. These eternal schoolboys were weighed out in its all proportion to their numbers and are certainly overrepresented among Tories. They have today plunged Britain into its worst crisis, exposing its insidious and self-serving ruling class like never before. From David Cameron, who recklessly gambled his country's future on a referendum in order to isolate some wingers of his Conservative Party, to the opportunistic Boris Johnson, who jumped on the Brexit bandwagon to secure the Prime Minister's chair, once warmed by his role model Winston Churchill, and the top-hatted, theocratical retro Jacob Rees-Mogg, whose fund management company has set up an office within the European Union, even as he vehemently scorns it. The British political class has offered to the world an astounding spectacle of complete and intellectual limited hustlers. Even a communist, even a columnist for The Economist, the organ of the British elite, now professes dismay over Oxford chums who thought that a life of bluff rather than expertise. Britain, the magazine bleated lament last month, is governed by its self-indulgent critique of self-indulged clique that rewards group membership above competence and self-confidence above expertise. In Brexit, the British chumocracy has, the column declared, has finally met its Waterloo. It is actually more accurate for those invoking British history to say that the partition of Britain's empire, of British Empire's ruinous exit strategy, has come home in the grotesque of irony. Borders imposed in the 1921 on Ireland, England's first colony, have proved to be the biggest stumbling block for the English. Brexiteers chasing imperial virality, moreover, Britain faces the prospect of partition if Brexit, a primarily English demand, is achieved and Scottish nationalists renew their call for independence. It is a measure of the English Brexiteers' political acumen that they were involved overtures to violate the Irish question and the contemptuous of the Scottish one. Ireland was critically positioned to ensure that Protestant settlers outnumbered the native Catholics in one part of the country. The division provoked decades of violence and consumed thousands of lives, in particularly the heated and it was partially healed in 1998 when the peace agreement removed the needs for security checks among the British-imposed partition line. The reimposition of customs and immigration regime along Britain's only land border with the European Union was always likely to be resisted with violence, but Brexiteers awakened late to this ominous possibility and have tried to deny it. A leaked recording revealed Mr. Johnson scorning concerns about the border as pure millennium bug stuff. Politicians and journalists in Ireland are understandably aghast over the aggressive ignorance of the English Brexiteers. Business people everywhere are outraged by the cavalier disregard of the economic consequences of the new borders, but none will surprise anyone who knows of the unconscionable breeziness of which the British ruling class first drew lines through Asia and Africa and then doomed the living people across them to endless suffering. The malign incompetence of the Brexiteers was precisely peaked during the Brexit was prefigured during hang on, there we go. The malign incompetence of the Brexiteers was precisely prefigured during Britain's exit from India in 1947, most strikingly in the lack of orderly preparation for it. The British government had announced that India would have its independence by June 1948. In the first week of June 1947, however, Mountbatten suddenly proclaimed that the transfer of power would happen on August 15, 1947, a ludicrously early date. As he hustled and blurted out, in July, a British lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe was entrusted with the task of drawing new boundaries of a country that he had never previously visited. Given only around 5 weeks to invent a political geography of India, flanked by an eastern and western ring called Pakistan, Radcliffe failed to visit any villages, communities, rivers or forest along the border he planned to carve up, diverging agricultural hinterlands from ports, cities, and abruptly reducing Hindus, Muslims and Sikhs on either side of the new border to a religious minority. Radcliffe delivered a plan for partition that effectively sentenced millions to death or desolation while bringing him the highest rank of a knighthood. Up to 1 million people died, countless women were abducted, raped, and the world's largest refugee population was created during the population transfers across Radcliffe's border, an extensive carnage that exceeds all apocalyptic scenarios of Brexit. In retrospect, Mountbatten had even less reason than Mrs. May to speed up the exit clock and create an insoluble and eternal problems. Just a few months after a botched partition, for instance, India and Pakistan were fighting a war over the disputed territory of Kashmir. None of the concerned parties were pushing for a hasty British exit. As the historian Alex von Trubelsen points out, the rush was Mountbatten's and his alone. Mountbatten was actually less pig-headed than Winston Churchill, whose invocation stiffens the spines of many Brexiteers today. Churchill, a fanatical imperialist, worked harder than any British politician to thwart Indian independence, and as Prime Minister from 1940 to 45 did much to compromise it. Seized by a racist fantasy about superior Anglo-Americans, he refused to help the Indians cope with famine in 1943 on the grounds that they breed like rabbits. Nevertheless to say, such ravings issued from an ignorance about India as intractable as that of the Brexiteers about Ireland. Churchill's own Secretary for State for India claimed that his boss knew much of the Indian problems as George III did of the American colonies. Churchill displayed in his long career a similarly imperialistic incredulence towards Ireland, sending countless of young Irish men to their deaths in a catastrophic military fiasco at Gallipoli in Turkey during World War I, and unleashing a brutal paramilitaries against the Irish nationalists in the 1920s. Many crimes of the empires turbulent adventures were enabled by Britain's great geographical power and then obscured by its cultural prestige. This is why images cherished by the British elite of itself as valiant, wise and benevolent could survive until recently. Much damning historical evidence about the matters from the disaster of Cyprus to Malaysia to Palestine to South Africa. In recent years, such privately educated and smooth-tongued men such as Neil Ferguson and Tony Blair could even present the British as saviours of suffering and blighted humanity, urging American neoconservatives to take up the white man's burden globally. In neo-imperialist ventures abroad, however, were followed by the rolling calamity of Brexit at home, and have cruelly exposed the bluff of what Hannah Aldrit called the quite quintoxic fools of imperialism. A petition comes home, threatening bloodshed in Ireland, succession in Scotland, and an unimaginable chaos of a no-deal Brexit looms. Ordinary British people stand to suffer the unrelated exit wounds once inflicted on Britain's bumbling chumocrats of millions of what happened to the Asians and Africans. More ugly history ironies may yet waylay Britain in this treacherous road to Brexit. But it is safe to say that a long-conceited British ruling class has finally come to its end of itself of what it was. And I completely 100% agree. We are not governed well. This is one of the things that Brexit has really brought home to roost. And one of the things that would solve this is putting term limits on MPs. I've said this before in many videos. I think term limits on MPs would help to solve this problem. But one of the things that we have to rid ourselves of, and particularly it's the problem of Brexiteers. I did this video months ago, like last year, all about how Brexit is tied to this historical idea of empire. And yet you have all these Brexiteers saying, oh no, that's not going to happen, that's not going to happen. And yet how many videos have we done on this subject of, Brexiteers and Tory MPs calling for essentially the reinvigoration of British Empire and imperialist policies. This is not a workable plan, and it's not going to work. But this is where we are, this completely unqualified confidence in Britain and the idea that it's really this massive secret superpower that is just being chained down by the European Union. It is not at all. It is completely self-imagined servitude. And it has been propped up by the press, by UKIP, all these people, all the Eurosceptics. They are the ones to blame for Brexit. They are the ones to blame to what comes after. And as I've said multiple times, these have been the last 2 good years of the United Kingdom and Britain in particular. So, yeah, hope you've enjoyed them.